Now, the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, is going to virtually meet G7 counterparts, NATO, Qatar and Turkey today to discuss future engagement with the Taliban. The Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has suggested he could recognise the Taliban as a legitimate government if it helps to prevent Afghanistan from becoming a base for Islamist terrorists to attack the West.
Well, former Foreign Secretary David Miliband has also said that Britain must work with the Taliban to deal with the humanitarian crisis. He's urged the UK and the US to be part of a full and balanced engagement led by the United Nations with the incoming Afghan government alongside Russia and China. Well, we're joined now by Afzal Amin, a former British Army officer who served in Afghanistan from 2012 to 2013. So, Afzal, now that the UK troops have withdrawn from Afghanistan, what is the next step?
I think the main next step really is to consider what the policy is going to be vis-a-vis the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, i.e. the Taliban now run almost all of the country. There may be a small sliver of resistance, but I don't see that lasting very long. So for all intents and purposes, they now do control the country. And with control, of course, comes responsibility. And their big responsibility, of course, is the 40 million Afghan citizens who are there, who are going to stay there, who have no prospect of going anywhere else. That is their country, and that's where they'll live. So the issue for us now in the UK, in the West, the G7, NATO, the UN, what are we going to do? And what is our policy towards them? And I think on the spectrum of policy choices, on the two extremes of boycotting them and trying to make them fail, there are huge ramifications. And on the other end of full diplomatic recognition and working with them, there are, of course, risks. So somewhere in between those two extremes, we've got to find a route forward that defends our interests properly, particularly on international terrorism issues, but also on migration flows. We want to reduce the number of people leaving Afghanistan and travelling to neighbouring countries and then further afield, and particularly arriving into Europe and into the UK. And to do that, we've got to then work with the authority on the ground, which, as it's clear, is the Taliban.
You're suggesting that this isn't potentially a binary decision. I would have thought that recognising the Taliban versus not recognising the Taliban seems pretty binary. What's the middle option that you're talking about here?
I think those terms are recognising, in terms of a diplomatic exchange, I don't see a Taliban ambassador bringing his credentials to Her Majesty the Queen anytime soon. But I do expect a British diplomatic team will be functioning in Kabul within weeks, if not within a month or so. We already, as the Chief of Defence Staff said in numerous interviews, we're already collaborating closely with the Taliban on the ground to deconflict activity. So that level of contact already exists. And of course, the Americans have been closely negotiating with the Taliban for the last 3 years or so to bring this war to an end. And even though diplomatic recognition may not be sort of like a formal, overt thing, the relationships already exist. The issue now is what's our policy? Because it's all very well having relationships for the purpose of evacuation, but in terms of moving forward, those 40 million Afghans need a lot of support. And we have, in the UK, I think uniquely, we have a lot of capacity here to help Afghans in a whole variety of ways. And if we just take one small example, in my one of my tours in Afghanistan, I worked as a political officer in the Foreign Office in Helmand. And nearby, there's a holy shrine called Kakrez, which is about 35 kilometers north of Kandahar. And at that time, fighters would come from Pakistan across the border into Kakrez and then move south towards Kandahar for routine fighting seasons. They would avoid the main border point, Spin Boldak, because obviously that was very heavily policed. And in that town of Kakrez, really a small village, there was a US Special Forces team who were sent there. When they arrived, there were 90 IEDs a month that they were facing. And on the first day, their officer in charge was killed and the warrant officer took over. And I think in total did about 6 patrols with them over various visits. And on one of the patrols, I was speaking to the warrant officer in charge, and he said, we've reduced the IEDs from 90 a month to 3 a month. And I asked him, how did you do that? It's extraordinary. And he said, well, we've brought these 2 US Air Force medics who are both females, and they provide medical services to the local villagers. And we know when we are winning, when the Taliban we are hunting in the day, their families knock on our front door and say, thank you for saving the lives of our women, particularly in childbirth scenarios. So work like that, which is genuine humanitarian work, can cut through so much of the hatred and some of the ideology and the suspicion of foreigners. And I think there's so much we can do in the UK because we've got, hundreds of years of connection between the UK and India and Afghanistan, India as a subcontinent, of course. And there are millions of people who travel between Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the UK every year. So there's a lot of links there that can be used to provide these sorts of services that in the end, I think will help the Afghan people and will, whether they want it or not, will force the Taliban to become a much more moderate force of governance than they might be otherwise.
That's just an incredible story. How do you build those relationships? Because presumably that's something that longer term is going to really pay dividends. The issue is going to be what happens in the next week, in the next couple of months.
Well, these are extraordinary sort of times we're in. And, in these difficult times, we have to dig deep into our own souls and see what kind of people are we, what are our values, what do we want to see in the world, are we the good guys or not, and so on. And so the less harm we can do, the better. So, for example, yesterday's drone strike, which just killed this family, including 6 young children. This is the kind of thing that we've got to stop doing. And yeah, there's a risk in not acting, but sometimes if we act, we increase the risk even further. And I remember my first tour in Afghanistan, the general in charge was Stan McChrystal, and super thin-skinned President Obama sacked him because he made a few funny jokes about Biden, which now seem to pale in comparison to the destruction that Biden has caused. So we've got this issue where people like Stan McChrystal were doing great work in foot patrols on the ground, working closely with Afghans to try and bring the violence to an end. And now we're in a situation where we've abandoned the country and we don't know what to do next. And we can't collapse under the failure of confidence because we've suffered this defeat. We've got to pick ourselves up, step forward, back into the breach and move forward. This idea that we can just abandon it is wrong. And full diplomatic recognition, of course, is too early. There's a lot of work to do, a lot of hard work, particularly in building those relationships on the ground. With every sector of a country, we've got to build relationships. So healthcare is one aspect. Economic policy, regional integration for trade, these are all aspects of Afghanistan that need to be addressed. I don't think the Taliban can do that on their own.
But you expect now that the UK could be re-establishing an embassy in Kabul in a matter of weeks. Is this really a realistic possibility? Will we be moving back into the building that we have just fled, leaving behind too many papers, according to some reports, that has been ransacked by the Taliban and now being used to root out those who helped us? Is that a realistic proposition, that we'll be moving back into that embassy that we've just abandoned?
Whether we occupy the same building or not, I don't know. But in terms of the UK having a diplomatic presence on the ground, it's an inevitability. The issue is, when does it happen? The Turks had a quaint diplomatic event the other day. They all left Afghanistan and went to the airport. And at the airport, they then drove back out of the airport and reoccupied the embassy under the invitation of the Taliban. So at one level, it's comical. Another level, it's quite procedural in terms of the Vienna Convention of how governing powers welcome emissaries of foreign powers. So I think in the very near future, we will see a diplomatic presence of the UK return to Afghanistan. The Americans are currently negotiating keeping their embassy up and running. And many, many other countries are either functioning with their embassies in Afghanistan or are in negotiation. So I think amongst the European powers, we'll see a lot of embassies either retain their presence or reopen if they've closed. And certainly the regional powers, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Pakistan, Iran, China, Russia, are all going to have fully manned embassy operations there. And the UK, I don't think we should just run away because we've suffered this defeat. We've got to re-engage. We've got to pick ourselves up, take a deep breath, and work for the good of the people of Afghanistan and for regional peace and security and for our own national interest. The option of not going back is simply not viable.
What do you make of the Prime Minister's criteria for the Taliban to make before he says we'll be able to recognise you as the authority?
He's right. That is the ideal scenario. But we have allies to whom we sell billions of dollars of weapons every year who have full diplomatic relations with us. who are nowhere near that ideal that the Prime Minister is asking the Taliban to achieve. So if that's the standard by which we're going to judge foreign powers, I fear that Britain will quickly lose a lot of diplomatic presence in many, many countries. So whilst I agree with the Prime Minister, that is the ideal, it's got to be a graduated approach to that ideal. It can't be achieve everything today or else we're not going to engage. I mean, that just won't work. We've got to work with them, I think. A couple of weeks ago, I would not have said that, but we've got to, in my work in counterinsurgency strategy, I didn't have the luxury of thinking about what the books say. I had to look at what was actually happening on the ground. And if the power on the ground in Afghanistan is the Taliban, the way that they are, that's all well documented, then the challenge for us is, are we willing to bring resources to bear to impact how they govern their country or not?
Well, absolutely fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for joining us here on GBNews this morning, and a very sombre one as well. No good options there.
That's Afzal Amin, former British Army officer who served in Afghanistan from 2012 and 2013. And we just heard as well there, was really involved with the counterinsurgency strategy as well. Really fascinating. Now,